an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Traitor Queen, chapters 29, 30, 31, and Epilogue. A new and frightening freedom, negotiating the future, and rewards. In these chapters, well, it's officially happening. We have a new couple. I'm not happy about it, but I have accepted that this is what's going on. And also, we find out who the traitor was. And as I sort of predicted, it doesn't matter. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode. I don't think Ashleigh is here right now, but Martin is here, and he's asking me if my dream ending was better than the actual ending. And for those who are not in the patron group, I had a dream last night that I read the final chapters of this book, and the ending was terrible. And I was like so upset and woke up with such a clear memory of it that before I had actually done the reading for the day, I kept thinking about what I was going to say based on the fake ending that I made up in my dream. And it took all afternoon for me to like shake that and remember that that wasn't real and didn't happen. So yes, this ending was certainly better than the ending in my dream. I will give it that. But it was pretty much a culmination of everything that I have had a problem with in this book coming to a head in a way that I feel like perfectly illustrates the overall issue with this author. And I went, because I've said before that like oftentimes after I finish a book, I will go and check out reviews just to see what other people thought. And I didn't find anybody who seemed to feel the way that I did about this book. And I don't really know what to make of that because in the past, I have been, like, my feelings on things have been generally borne out by the common opinion. And while there have been people who disagreed, I saw enough people echoing my sentiments that it made me feel at least a little valid. This was not the case with this book. All of the like comments that I saw were mostly high praise. And it has like 4.5 out of 5 stars on Audible, I think. And frankly, I can't get over that because the ending of this, I'm just going to talk about this whole thing because it really is the like main revelation that remains in this last section. Everything else by now has sort of been shaken out. We dealt with Skellen. The war is over. They won. Everything else is sort of just like whipped cream. But figuring out who Skellen's contact was the one mystery. And as it turns out, it's somebody that, if I'm not mistaken, we have never even met before or heard his name. If we have heard his name, it was only when Jonna told us, perhaps, because apparently the guy who sent her to the wrong classroom, when she was frantically trying to find Lilia in order to send her down to help, was the traitor. And Martin says his name has been mentioned, I think, but that's it. Yeah. Look, I don't understand making somebody that we don't even know who they are the traitor. Why would you do that? And I really felt like that was inevitable. It didn't seem to me by now that Callan was the bad guy. I had pretty much gotten over that suspicion. So I expected that regardless of who it turned out to be, it wasn't going to be very high impact for us because the only magicians that are even left in the guild that we know who they are Callan, Osen, and Rothan. And I know it's not fucking Rothan. I don't think it's Osen. Like, that just seemed completely unlikely. And I had completely left off even suspecting Callan. So if it's none of them, I figured I'm probably not going to care. And not only did I not care, but it felt so... The whole thing with Skellen is so underdeveloped that I just don't care anyway. Because this person, we don't really get a good sense of the damage they've done in the midst of what's happening. Do you know what I mean? Everything that we hear about Skellen and the danger that he poses is in pretty much direct relationship to Sari and his little band and where they're hiding and how they're doing. And other than that, we don't see the effects of Skellen taking over the underworld in the city. We don't see things beginning to really fall apart in the guild. It gets hinted at a little bit at the very start of things, but I think things needed to have been taken in a much more severe direction. We needed POVs in the guild that were actually aware of the problems. Maybe if we were in Lady Venara's POV instead of Sania's, or if Sania wasn't going to Sachaka. Because I said in the last section, we didn't need Sania in this book at all. She really doesn't do anything. Her POV doesn't really bring much to the story. And all I got from her as a major plot point was her falling in love with Regin, which I think is absolute garbage, and I hate it. So if we're going to have Sania, have her stay. And she's already got hospitals going on. Let us see the ranks of the magicians beginning to get blazed through with this addiction, and begin to see the way that the city is decaying in a much more substantial and visceral way. Because literally the only thing that we ever get about what's going on with Skellen taking over is Gaul going up to the surface to get supplies and coming back down and just telling Sari, people still think that you're alive, or people are on your side. Why are we not seeing that? Give us somebody on the surface, and then that will mean something. And it just didn't feel to me, by the time we dealt with Skellen, like he actually posed much of a threat to anybody except for Sari and his 3 people. And the Rowett didn't feel nearly as threatening as it had at the start of the book when it was introduced, and I really expected there to be more going on with that. Because at first the idea of introducing this drug, I thought was really interesting. I thought that this was a really good sort of allegory for what goes on in the world and addiction and the fascination of some people being able to be healed from their addiction and other people still crave it despite the fact that they have been magically healed. I really liked all of that. But that was immediately removed from the story by taking Sania out of the city and sending her to Sachaka. So Martin says, I think it's supposed to be because he's part of the guild leadership and a healer, but it just falls flat. Yeah, it does. This would have been another good reason if we had Sania stay in the city, or if we had Lady Venara's perspective. We would have not only seen firsthand the effects of this drug and the way that the city was beginning to fall apart, but also we'd have gotten to know this person better. And so when it turns out that he is the traitor, it would have meant something. We would have cared. But instead, we send Sania to Sachaka for this kind of nothing negotiation that doesn't really go anywhere. It was just such a baffling choice. And really, I feel like I can say now that I'm at the final chapters of this book, it was bad. This was a bad book and not a good trilogy overall, because nothing really happened in the first 2 that couldn't have been cut down substantially. what we had in these 3 books was the equivalent in plot of 1 book stretched out and filled with a ton of stuff that doesn't matter and isn't fleshed out enough. It's a weird combination of, I'm going to stretch it and use it, like create all of this filler, but all of the filler is not going to be about the stuff that's actually interesting to the reader. It's going to be stuff that's like, you know, re-explaining things that we know already, or conversations between people that don't matter, but then something that we were really fascinated by never gets brought up again, or not getting to see certain types of magic that are spoken about later. There's just a lot of potential here, and I think that's why this makes me so angry. When there's something that's bad, but it's bad in a way that there was no fixing this. It was just, you know, this was a bad idea. It was badly executed, whatever. Then you can just be like, well, that sucked. Oh well, and move on with your life. But something like this is so much more irritating because there's so much potential here. We know that this writer can be a good writer. She's done good work before that I have read for this show. So I know it's in her. She's created this entire universe with this like magical system and these worlds in place within it, these countries that are really like fascinating and have all of this like potential in them. And yet it's just, she never follows through. And I think that for me makes it so much more frustrating. There's kernels of really interesting stuff here, and she doesn't pursue the things that I care about. The Rohit gets dropped. Skellen is barely a thing, in my opinion. We have Skellen's mother, who comes from this other like land, which we hear discussed a tiny bit at the very, very end of this book. But I fully expected the country that she came from to be a factor in this trilogy. I fully expected when she was introduced and we hear about all of this from where she's from, the way magicians are treated, I assumed this was being set up so that we would get to see these people begin to come to Kyrelia, a country that the Kyrelians didn't even know existed, evidently, because it's across this like vast desert. And at the very, very end of these chapters, it's just mentioned, oh yeah, the people in that country have invented guns. So I don't know what to think, because when Ashleigh was in the chat last time I recorded on the previous episode, she said that as far as she knows, Trudy Canavan isn't interested in this universe anymore. She's not going to be writing anymore. But that felt to me, for sure, like we were setting up for another book series, or at least a book. And I don't know when I'm going to learn, because every time that I seem to think this author is setting something up, she's not. So I'm thinking here as I read the end of this and we bring this country up again that we haven't heard about since Larandra first spoke about it in her testimony. I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe we are going to get something with this. And then the book ends and I'm like, oh. And I truly do not understand bringing this up at all if you're not going to pursue it or do anything with it within the series. That there is so much. If we had cut half of the first 2 books, pulled all of this plot backward into the first book, and then built this like new threat into the story, then you would have enough to carry another 2 books after. You could have the war in Sechaka over by the end of the first book, instead of making it be what it seems to, it was like intended that it would be the whole trilogy was working towards. But we don't really get much, if I'm remembering correctly, in Sechaka in the first 2 books. I'm really struggling, actually, now that I think about it, to like remember the first 2 books, because all I can recall is the ongoing like Rowett thing and how it seemed like it was being sort of ramped up. So I'm going to pull back and just start talking about what actually happens in these chapters. But I have just, and I really feel for Ashleigh because she hadn't finished reading this before she commissioned it. So she was saying in the previous episode that she wouldn't have if she had finished it and known how bad this was in terms of the way that it does not follow through. She wouldn't have commissioned it. And I feel bad because, you know, people are spending money for me to cover stuff. And I hate to just shit all over something, but you know, it's like when you have an expectation because you've read something by this author set in this universe before, it's impossible to keep yourself from having that expectation. You know, it's not like I came into this and didn't know who she was and was simply let down in general. I came into this and I thought what I was in for. So I feel bad because I've just sort of like ranted the past few episodes. And I always wonder, you know, when I cover the Ancestor trilogy, which is like Grey Sister, Holy Sister, which is what I'm covering now, the author of those books, Mark Lawrence, actually listens to my Spoil Me episodes and has like gotten in contact with me on Twitter and been like, that was a really, really interesting episode and good POV and whatever. And I wonder sometimes if an author is ever going to stumble across one of these and be interested and then hear me just tearing their work apart. And if they do, it is what it is. I'm not mincing words to save somebody's feelings. I want to be honest about how I feel about work. But Trudy Canavan, if you are listening, you are better than this. And I don't know what happened. I'm certain you're aware that this wasn't up to your usual standard. And I'm really curious to know what happened there. But man, the one thing I could say about this is I'm sure it could spawn some really good fan fiction. Because, like I said, there are so many like little nuggets here and there that are ripe to be expanded upon. And since she didn't do that, there are other people who can pretty much whole cloth invent big sections of a story. And they don't actually have much that they, like many parameters to stay within because she hasn't set them. So in that respect, I find that sort of compelling. You know, I'm not somebody who really writes fan fiction, but if I were going to, I'd probably do it for this series because it's just so frustrating. And I don't feel the need for fan fiction on works that, to me, feel like they are fully fleshed out or they've explored everything. This is something that I could actually see that being of interest. So, chapter 29, A New and Frightening Freedom. It begins with Lilia and Anya together. Anya is still exhausted. And she had found out in the last section that her father was dead. She thought that Skellen was lying to her about that. But she's, you know, just deep in grief. And they're heading back on this ship, and I'm trying to find the spot. But the magicians Rothan had recruited at the docks stood guard over the crew taken from Skellen's ship. Seeing them follow his orders unquestioningly, though they clearly had no idea of the reasons for them, had amazed her. Magicians weren't usually so cooperative, at least not from what she'd seen. But then she saw the respect in their faces and remembered that Rothan was not just a higher magician, but had been Black Magician Sania's guardian and teacher and had no small part in fighting the Ichani invasion. So they get to the dock and Anya spots Callan. And understandably, Anya really doesn't like Callan because, in her opinion, he shelved doing his job in favor of this whole other plan that he came up with, despite the suggestions of both Lilia and Sari. And so, in some ways, she could say he is responsible for her father's death because he didn't take the steps that he should have, in her opinion. I really wanted this to be more of a confrontation. Anya is so angry, but she doesn't actually say anything to him. She just is like, what is he doing here? He fucked this up. But pretty much she falls back completely once he reaches them and begins to talk to Lilia. And Rothan tells him about, how Skellen is dead now, and his mother also. Part of me wonders if she is, like, I'm assuming that, but because we don't actually have a body. Anytime in fiction that somebody is allegedly dead, but we don't have a body, I don't believe it. But because of how inconsistent the writing has been with this, I'm willing to believe it here, which is a rule I don't normally break. But I wouldn't be surprised if that was a sort of like open-ended thing that the author had thought was decisive, while I consider it to be sort of, it's potentially, the return of Larandra, the next book, So they head back, and Rothan is told that they're going to be having a meeting with the king about what's been going on with the, revolution, essentially, in Sechaka, and they've been talking about that. And they go off for a moment and talk about how they think they have discovered who the traitor is. But all we hear is like, are you sure it was him? And they don't actually say his name. But this bit here, I'm like really, really curious about what could have been if we had just done something more. I would have liked it if it was somebody that had been, honestly, it would have been at least more interesting if it was Callan. He felt like he was set up too much to be like, it was just the sort of thing, whenever you're reading a mystery novel and there's somebody who looks really guilty from the outset, an experienced mystery reader knows that's usually a red herring. If not, then it's kind of fun. If it turns out, oh yeah, no, they looked super guilty, and they were super guilty. I actually enjoy when that happens. But in this case, I really felt like it was being like poured on pretty thick, that he was acting weirdly and people didn't like him. However, because of what the alternative turns out to be, I feel like him being the guilty party would have worked better. And at least, even if it wasn't really a surprise, it would have meant something that it was a person who had trained Lilia so closely and had been really instrumental in her being able to like defend herself against Skellen and everything, because she used the, black magic. So then we go to Tyend and Daniel. And Daniel is really, has been left Ashaki Achadi's library with a letter. And later on, he sees the slaves like gathering people's possessions and building bonfires with them in the street. And he gets pretty agitated at the thought of not only books being burned, although that's a major one, but just the idea of burning so many like precious objects, things that are beautiful or took great craftsmanship or perhaps contain a lot of history. And it's one of those things where on the one hand, I do understand that. I'm somebody who loves the aesthetic. I'm very into beauty. And to see people destroying things of beauty would be really painful. And I understand that. But it's so hard for me because of the way that Daniel was painted in the previous chapters as being like antagonistic towards the traitors in favor of the slavers. And one can say whatever they like about how he cared about Ashaki Achadi and he was caught up in his emotions because this guy meant something to him. Sure. And if that were how it was painted and that were it was all, then fine. But the way it's actually written, he's talking about how like ruthless they are and how he has to make sure that they don't spread their brand of, quote, freedom to Karelia. Daniel is on the wrong side of this in such a, like, in his heart type of way that him looking at these people burning things and feeling regret over it, it hits really different when he hasn't been on their side the entire time. You know, if it were somebody that had been super, like, pro-revolution and slavery is wrong and I refused to engage with this, like, system and made me super uncomfortable, but I do love beauty and I see this and it hurts my heart, that would be one thing. And I think that's what the author's trying to go for. I don't think she realizes how making Daniel so sympathetic to the slavers has ruined him as a character for me. Like, as far as I am concerned, he's not the same person that he was when we first met him. And I mean that in an entirely terrible way. I think we're supposed to have seen him grow here, and that she interprets this like as an empathy that because of his romantic entanglement, he is more like open-minded than other people are. But as Ashleigh said in the chat last time, she's trying to both sides slavery, and you can't do that. You can't demonstrate to me how these human beings were treated as objects and property and have Daniel rooting for the slavers to win as he watches a battle, and then expect me to, like, not take it a certain way when he's judging how the slaves are celebrating their newfound freedom. Like, it's just, it hits wrong. And I really feel like I will say this, I was surprised that by the time things wrap, he and Tyenn aren't together. I kind of expected he was going to turn the corner and come back to Tyenn, and especially because it's established, Tyenn says to him, I would take you back. I would be with you again, but I can tell you don't want that. I thought that was being put into place because they were paving the way for the two of them to join up again. I'm not mad that they didn't get back together because Daniel sucks, and evidently, like, Tyenn just deserves better, in my opinion. But it is really surprising to me how much of a whimper their relationship sort of seems to end on here. There's no real, like, right up until the end, Daniel is still mourning Ashaki Achadi, and he's in a conversation with Lorcan about it. And Lorcan's, like, bummed because as much as the guy was on the wrong side, he did try and help Lorcan escape the country. And he feels like, well, I guess I didn't really pay the guy back for what he did for me. But Tyenn cuts in and says, Ashaki Achadi would have turned you in a moment if he thought that was what would help S'chaka. And Daniel gives Tyenn this, like, dirty look. And Tyenn just sort of stares at him like, what? Do you want to try and argue with me? Because you fucking know exactly what that guy was about. And you know I'm right. And I really loved that moment because Tyenn, as much as, like, a lot of people, I think, if they were in the position Tyenn is in, they would choose to do everything they could to, like, suck up to the person that they're hoping will take them back. And Tyenn is not willing to mince words with Daniel. As much as he's willing to, like, admit, I liked Ashaki Achadi. I thought that he was, like, a decent dude. But I'm under no illusions as to what he stood for and what his priorities were. I respect that he's willing to be this direct. But I can't help but sort of laugh that really is almost the last interaction that we see between the two of them, is Daniel being angry that Tyenn called out that Ashaki Achadi in the end was a fucking S'chakan who was loyal to his king and to slavery. And then we just don't ever really see any sort of, like, resolution between the two of them. I found that really, really surprising. I would like it. I mean, part of me is also glad that they're not back together because I don't love the whole idea of there's only like two people potentially in the world that you could like. This is one of those love triangle things that happens in like Hallmark movies as well, where we pretend that you have the choice between only these two men, you know, and that's all you've got. And I'm happy for Tywin and Daniel to not be like, well, this other thing didn't work out, so I guess we are just by default with one another again. But I am really surprised. I thought that for sure we were going to have a little bit more of a resolution there. So that's pretty much like they go back to the house because like later on when he sees people burning things, he gets really worried about the library. And he's just like, finally talks to Lorcan and is like, dude, so I got given this like incredibly valuable library and I am super concerned that it's just going to get looted and burned down. And Lorcan gets in touch with Savara and she establishes some like guards at the door in order to give Daniel access. I'm really wondering if they'll let him take things with him because Lorcan says that he doesn't believe that will be allowed. But you know, the slaves are burning so much that would it be noticed if they hadn't mentioned it at all and he just went and loaded a cart with stuff, would anybody have even been aware it happened? I feel like it's sort of established in this way that he's going to be staying in S'chaka for the foreseeable future in this house now. And speaking of which, I found it interesting how the infrastructure is talked about. Lorcan and Tyvara, they have a conversation later on about how they're going to have to basically rebuild the city. Because if everybody is living in their own, if everybody ideally has their own home, then these huge estates with like one big main house and servants' quarters, they're not going to be useful for anything. You know, people can live in them temporarily, but there'll be a lot of like cohabitation that isn't equal to having your own home. So they're going to have to be like knocking things down and rebuilding them from the ground up. And I thought that was a really interesting concept that I'm sure if we looked at like the history of places that had emancipated slaves, this would come up, finding like housing and creating an infrastructure there for an influx of people who are going to be able to own or at least rent their own places. But, you know, in like the United States, there was so much sharecropping. There was such a, you know, slavery light that went on after slavery was officially over that I really wonder how that would work out, you know, because in the United States, slavery was ended by a decree from the sitting president who it was not the same as an uprising from the ranks of the slaves. Our leaders were not deposed and replaced with representatives who had either experienced slavery or had a vested interest in the freedom of slaves. The status quo was very much still in place here, even as this all fell apart. So this is just a really interesting scenario that I'm sure that like in history this has happened places, but I don't know exactly where. And I'd be interested to see how this shook out in real life in cities where you would have these like estates, you know, and everything is built in such a way that there's two of everything, you know, master's quarters, servants' quarters, master's like sitting room, and then like servants' quarters, sort of common area, upstairs, downstairs, basically, you know. And I thought that was a neat idea that got brought up because it's a real, something that I think is really, what's the word I want? The effects of creating a whole new society and culture is underestimated by a lot of people. I think that when you start to educate yourself on the structures of government and justice and realize how much societal expectation or accepted norms are baked into all of the ways that those sorts of things work and are set up, then you start to get a better idea of just what it will take if things are to really change. And you get a little bit overwhelmed, because so much would need to be fundamentally razed to the ground and rebuilt from scratch. And I think that's like something in the United States that a lot of us are really struggling with, is like the pandemic has really brought into sharp relief how poorly built we are as a nation to take care of our people. We have nothing in place as a safety net for those who fall ill and lose their health insurance, who are kept from working, there's so much that we would have to fundamentally change. And we have this lovely idea about, when you hear about slavery, just ending slavery. But if you are in it and you watch how this actually shakes out, you have to change so much about not only just what they talk about here, the logistics, the actual buildings that people live in need to be changed. But then there's just the mindset, the expectation of how you are treated versus other people. It's different in T'Chaka in a way, because slaves don't really look different from the elite, right? Like, you can know who the Ashaki are by, or is it Ashadi? I can never keep that straight. But you can tell because they carry knives, because of how they're dressed. That is how you tell. So it's different than, in the United States, where we had enslaved a different race. And so it was like, there was always going to be this remaining barrier of judging someone by appearance, and that being like the knee-jerk, immediate judgment call. Because T'Chaka doesn't have that specifically, I'm really curious what sorts of markers will remain in place that will tell people whether somebody deserves to be treated well or not. Like, maybe being able to read, something like that, But yeah, so anyway, I did like that discussion, and it turns out that like Tyvara's low-key in line of succession. Like, they're not trying to do a monarchy, I don't think. It's not her being related to Savara. It's more, she has been Savara's right hand and is positioned in such a way that, because probably partially due to her relationship with Lorcan, and her potentially paving the way for there to be better relations now between T'Chaka and Kyrelia, that might put her in a place where she could be at an advantage having that relationship there. But as she says to him, she's not even sure she really wants the job. And I know for myself, that sounds like it sucks. No thanks, I'm good. And he had sort of hoped that he was going to be able to be the contact. But there's no, way that they're going to entrust that to somebody who isn't a born traitor and somebody who is a man. And I was surprised that he even had hoped for it, because I was just out of hand dismiss the idea that he would ever get to be put in that position. And honestly, being her like liaison for this is a really good place to be. I think he wound up in the best possible position that he could have hoped for. So, and there's an interesting thing here as well. 'Cause Lorcan, his mother is still in T'Chaka, and she's been following. And they have this moment when they're on the street, her and, Regin, and they see some remaining Achadi who are going to try and like attack a couple of either they're traitors who are like drained of power, like they've just been fighting and they don't have anything left, or they're just like gonna sucker punch them from behind. And Regin has to convince Sania to step in, and she's like arguing about how, well, this would be considered interference and we said that we wouldn't do that. I had such a hard time with this. They've won already. You're not interfering at this point, and these are people who were on the side of right. They've won. It's fine. And the fact that Regin has to like convince her was odd. I feel like this author is just trying so hard to make Regin bring something to the table that will cause me to feel better about the relationship between the two of them. And it's just super duper not going to happen. And the idea that Sania would have to be convinced to like help these innocent people who are about to be attacked by slavers. That's not a hero that I want, that's not a protagonist that I'm happy to have. And later on, when it's announced that this went down with her, Savara gets the news, and she was hoping to be able to sort of hold it over Sania's head that she didn't follow orders and stay in place so that she could get something out of her. Lorcan tells Savara, I wouldn't do that. And when she says, I could use you as leverage, he says something like, only if you're really brave. I advise getting to know my mother a little bit better before you try and push her too far. And this is one of those moments where I feel like he is advising the queen in this moment with a tone that implies that Sania is really dangerous and like threatening in a way that I do not see to be true at all. I have not felt like Sania is a particularly strong person in these books. It was in the first trilogy, yes. Since then, she's just been riddled with self-doubt. She has been making like questionable choices. I mean, the whole thing with Regin is just unfortunate. And so hearing him talk about her like she's this, tigress that's going to lash out, I really would have liked to see a bit more of her flying off the handle, perhaps, to indicate that this was a legitimate concern. Because as far as I was reading, I was like, Sania? Like, it felt like he was talking about a stranger. I just didn't get what he even meant. Savara listens to him. She's like, all right, well, I guess I'll pull back on that idea. But to me, it just didn't really actually seem like a concern. Also, they have their confrontation with Kalia. And she admits that she did set the whole thing up. She like lured some Ichani back towards the group and was hoping that they would take out Savara and probably also Lorcan and Tyvara, let's be honest. And instead, Helana got in the way because she was like putting out stones for protection around the building. And Kalia didn't know that she was there. So Helana just steps out into the midst of things, not realizing that they're about to be attacked. And Kalia really feels guilty because it was not her intention to hurt an innocent bystander. But Savara is in this position where she's, first of all, relying on Lorcan telling her whether or not Kalia is lying. And she's not lying. She comes out and admits what she did. But then she has to decide what to actually do. And she feels that Kalia has too many skills for them to, they can't spare her when there are a lot of injured people who need care. This healing magic isn't well known enough amongst the traitors by this point for there to be, a number of people working on it at once. So many more people still have to be taught. And also, as she puts it, it would be really bad for morale. They just won this huge war. It's a major accomplishment. Things are being set into place. And then to have people find out that somebody within their own ranks attempted a coup, essentially, it's a bad look. It makes you look weak. It sets up a precedent a little bit that like somebody was going to attempt to do something like this. And you want to present a united front to your own people and to other countries that are watching them with great interest, I'm sure, to see exactly how things shake out and how the power winds up being balanced. So Savara winds up not punishing Kalia and just sort of makes her promise that she will never, she says, let's see. Swear you will never speak of it to anyone unless on my orders, and swear you will never attempt to cause me, Tyvara, and Lorcan harm again. And I'm really not satisfied with this. It's understandable. I feel like the reasoning given for Savara making the choice she does is good reasoning. Like I'm not saying that it is poor character writing or, anything like that. But, and in some ways, the fact that I'm not satisfied with it is good, because I think that's meant to be how you feel. Like, if you are a leader, you don't get to indulge in punishment for your own gratification. You don't get to just take revenge on people because you're angry or bitter or have a grudge. You have to keep in mind what's good for everyone. And the fact that Savara chose to keep this secret is good for everyone. Like, she's made the smart decision as a leader. But as somebody who has watched Kalia, like, basically attempt to kill Lorcan and attempt to take over 1,000,000 times, it feels like now, I cannot rest with her just, like, being out in the community and having to trust that she's going to keep her word on not doing something like this again. I think that as it is written here, I am meant to take it on faith, and that if we were to continue reading this story, she wouldn't step out of line again. I think we're meant to believe that. But personally, when somebody has demonstrated this level of willingness to break with leadership and has such like faith in their own judgment of how things should be done, it's only a matter of time before they begin to get that itch again and they start to look at doing things their own way and disobeying orders again. I don't really know what that means in terms of how I would have dealt with this, though, because other than just straight up executing her, which I don't think would be worthwhile at this point, I don't really know what kind of punishment you could make that would be helpful other than imprisonment. And that is like both imprisonment and execution, I think, have the same effect, which is to make it very public what happened and make you look weak. So I guess really the best thing is just to have Savara's two closest people keep an eye on her and make sure that this bitch doesn't try it again. But we know that both Lorcan and Tyvara are going to Curelia, and so Savara is going to be left alone without advisors who know that this happened and who know that Kalia is not to be trusted. So that, for me, leaves her a little bit too open, and that worries me a bit. So Sania winds up being sent to manage the hospices that the traitors have set up just for like the day. And Lorcan, there's this weird thing that, again, because Lorcan is, really cautioning against getting his mother angry. There's also this whole thing about how they need to make sure she gets back to Curelia sooner rather than later, because she's going to try and like take over the hospices and not want to like, it's a weird thing that I didn't really understand, his concern about her managing this and the insistence on getting her back to Curelia as soon as possible. I didn't really understand what he was worried about. I haven't seen anything from Sania to indicate that she would be like power hungry here or insistent on doing things her way. Like, she has been careful, I feel, and sensitive to what cultures dictate, and she's done her own thing in terms of following Lorcan against orders, but that was because it was her son's welfare. This is a different thing, and I don't really understand this concern at all. So it was a weird, like, eventually he goes and talks to Daniel and asks him, you know, will you make it sound like the guild wants her to come home? Because if she knows it came from me, it's going to upset her. And I just didn't really understand what he was even worried about, or why the author needed Sania to go home so quickly, if that was what it was. But yeah, it was just such a sort of a weird thing. And also, this is when we find out too that like Maria wanted to be a healer and had intended to like set up a hospice after she was done traveling the world. I will say it again. Maria is such a wasted bit of potential there. She seems like she could have been really interesting. And even Sania's like, where was Venara hiding this one? I'm like, where was the author hiding this one? She's just, you know, and I don't know. I even set aside the fact that I get irritated that practically every female character always wants to be a healer, almost. And setting that aside, Maria has just been very capable, and I would have liked a POV from her, you know, if we were going to do this. So Lorcan and Daniel, things are like strained between the two of them because obviously Lorcan straight up switched sides. He finds out about Achadi and how he died. And eventually, you know, when Lorcan's like, man, I did feel like I sort of owed him, and that sucks that I'm never really going to get to like repay him for what he did. Then it seems like the tension breaks between the two of them. But yeah, for a minute there, Daniel is just really feeling away. And honestly, I don't care because Daniel sucks. And let's see, I'm trying to find, if Mother gets the slightest hint that it came from me, she'll be more determined to stay. Can you suggest to Osen having her here will put a strain on relations between S'chaka and the Allied lands? Why is that true? What is that? And then finally, Lorcan's like, he shows Daniel the Source Stone. He says, this is why you should have my mother sent home. This is why the Allied lands should establish good relations with S'chaka. It contains the strength of only a few magicians. The trouble with Store Stones is that you can't know how much power they can hold. Too much and they'll shatter, releasing all their power. It would be safer to have several Store Stones holding a little power than a few holding a lot. But even then, it could be the solution to defending the Allied lands without resorting to black magic. And I don't, again, this revelation that they know how to make Store Stones. Daniel at first is like, so they were lying. And Lorcan has to be like, no, we sort of gave them the idea, actually. My bad. The idea that this stone's existence is why she has to go back, it doesn't really work for me either. I don't understand the reasoning behind this concern. So, going back to Lilia, she has to go and perform the mind reading, as it turns out, on the magician that is suspected of being in league with Skellen. And the way that this works is really funny because, like, nobody knows that you don't have to be a black magician to read somebody's mind against their will. Except for her and Callan. Callan is initially the one that is going to read this guy's mind. And Lilia stops him because, as she says, I have been sort of suspecting Callan myself. She just says that shit out, which I was like, wow. I mean, I guess now is as good a time as any to make it public how you were worried about this. But I can't imagine being Callan, hearing that, and just being like, oh, wow, really? God, I would be so offended. But yeah, so her idea is basically, if it is Callan, he can say that this dude's like mind is saying whatever in order to cover his own tracks. So she reads his mind, and he tries to set up all of these like sort of evasive maneuvers. And eventually she is able to break past it. Oh, and she also, by the way, reads Callan's mind and realizes like that he is he's got a lot of grief over the fact that he's addicted to Rowett. Like, he takes it as a personal slight that he has this vulnerability because he is so dedicated to the guild that this is killing him a little bit, that he is like weak in any way. But she realizes that he actually was really trying. It wasn't like he was just dicking around regarding Skellen in the first place. So this other guy, she saw through everything. He tried to show her lies, but she saw through everything. She saw where it had begun at a brazier house. She saw the suppliers that had suggested he avoid purchasing through the houses and buy direct. She saw how he had grown concerned that the guild would disapprove of the drug, so he had begun to encourage its use by more and more magicians so they would resist a ban. All his thoughts were laced with a ferocious ache for Rowett. He feared he wouldn't be able to buy it now that Lilia had killed Skellen. He hated her for that. His only consolation was that so many other magicians would be suffering the same pain. It was a relief to withdraw her mind and return to the room. Yeah, this is a really good idea, actually, getting other people hooked so that you will have a united front of folks who are trying to keep it from being banned. It makes total sense, and it's a tale as old as time, really, for a lot of, substances. But it didn't really occur to me, and it makes a lot of sense. And he tries to say that Lilia is lying, and Osin is like, you're the one who didn't want to do a voluntary mind read, so if you're claiming she's lying, then submit to a regular mind read. What's the problem? And he won't do it. I'll prove my innocence in more convincing ways. What does that mean? Because, and now that we know that Callan's innocent, have him read the guy too, and he'll say the same thing, and then you're good. But yeah, I'm really like, well, how did you think that you were going to be able to prove your innocence, sir? Thankfully, there are no other spies within the guild. It seems like he's the only one. So Osin is like, well, thank God for that. And in the end, when we finally, the epilogue, Sania is back. They're having this meeting because Tyvara and Lorcan are going to be coming into the city, and they both know black magic, but it's illegal to practice it. And they're having this meeting at the palace, deciding exactly how they're going to change the laws. And it's sort of a weird, the take that Sania has here, I found sort of odd. But I'm trying to find the spot. I expect these laws will go some way toward improving behavior of guild magicians. It's clear from the corruption Rowett has revealed in the guild's ranks that some magicians aren't immune to vice and profiting at the expense of others. You have a lot to discuss, so I'll leave you to it. Bring me a summary of your progress at midday. So they begin to speak, and it says, Sania felt an unexpected sadness, and so everything changes again. Just like after the Achani invasion, when we knew we had to accept black magic as our only form of defense and restore the guild by taking in lower-class novices. There were so many unforeseen consequences, like the thieves battling each other and the city overtaking the slums. We can try to make laws that control the changes that magical gemstones and an alliance with Sashaka will bring, but they will have effects we don't anticipate. All they could do was try, and for her part, attempt to ensure that when Lorcan returned to Euralia, even if only to visit, he and the family he might eventually have would be safe and welcome. It was an odd ending. There's no triumph. There's no feeling of relief to her as personally a black magician, finding out that this is maybe not going to be outlawed in the same way. There's no sense of anticipation of these changes and the way that, this might improve. Like, she's thinking about it with this sadness at the change rather than an excitement. And I really would have thought, as somebody who was a lower class, person when she was like outside of the guild before her abilities began to manifest, that she would have nothing but optimism because they had managed to take in people from lower class families to teach them. And that was a major thing that, there were unintended consequences and things that they hadn't foreseen. But that's all in all a very positive step forward toward equality. And it just seems like she's not happy about it. There's just a sense of I wish things could just stay the same. And that's not the Sania that we've known in these books. She has never been, I want things to stay the same. She's always been pretty vociferous about the fight for lower classes and being frustrated at the elitism in both legislation and attitudes in the guild. So it was sort of an odd, note to end it all on. And I just didn't really know what to make of it. I feel like I've lost track of these characters somewhere, It feels like they are just not the same people. And the author doesn't seem to know who they are anymore either. So, yeah, I'm going to wrap up because I'm over time. But what a mess, honestly. That's my summary of this book. It's just what a mess. So much could have been done, but this is what we got. Trudy, you're better than this. What are you doing? But I do appreciate Ashleigh commissioning it all, and I'm sorry, Ashleigh, that I have just been so hard on it. Hopefully, you can forgive me for that. And don't forget to get in touch with me and tell me what you want to do with those last few slots, because there were 3 more for this book, and we don't need them. So let me know what you want to do with those. And thank you, Martin, for hanging out in the chat with me. And I will be seeing you all again soon. With something, not a new episode of this, but Ashleigh will let me know. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.